This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week, making his second appearance on the podcast, is my guest, Charles Dowding. Charles is the leading proponent worldwide of no-dig gardening. He's authored and co-authored many books and articles on the subject, including his latest book, No Dig, which is the result of 40 years' experience and looks set to become the definitive text on the subject. He produces enough food to sell to local restaurants and inhabitants, to feed all his course attendees and visitors, and also his own household, from his plot, which, until recently, has only been 1/4 of an acre in size, proving categorically that no dig equals maximum productivity. He's a prolific generator of media content. His YouTube channel has over 55 million views, and he's brought the no-dig technique to a worldwide audience. I began by asking Charles about his route into gardening.
Well, it was through an interest in nutrition, I guess. When I was at university, I read a book called Animal Rights, and it was by an Australian philosopher, Peter Singer. And I'd grown up on a farm surrounded by animals, dairy cows, and hadn't really considered any of these kinds of things. And then this was like a bolt from the blue, and I suddenly started thinking about animals as sentient beings. And after reading that book, I became a vegetarian. So I was at age about 20. And then that was very unusual in those days. That was like 1979. And then from there, it just developed into an interest in nutrition generally. And then that took me into growing organically and avoiding chemicals in food and getting healthy food. So that led me to growing food because I'd grown up on a farm. I had that possibility. I did start at first market garden actually in 1982. From there, it's just carried on.
You mentioned obviously growing without chemicals. I think there is plenty of evidence to suggest that that is the best way for you. In terms of nutrition and organic growing, do you know of any evidence to prove that it's better to grow organic and consume organic?
Well, those two comments in your question, they're linked because I think, until recently anyway, the whole emphasis has been on the chemical content of food in terms of nutrition. Not maybe the whole emphasis, but most of it. And I think it's very hard for anyone to prove substantial differences, if you like. And I think the way the debate is going now, where we're looking more at biology and microbes, is much more powerful because, we didn't know this, like back in the 80s when I started, everything was very chemical-based. And the whole way that people were looking at farming, even at organic farming, it was, these chemical guys would say to me, oh, you can't get much NPK from your compost or manure or that kind of thing. It was quite derogatory, really, because to them it just seemed like a real backward step, and they had these powerful possibilities in a bag of fertilizer to put on loads of food really fast and get these plants growing super quickly and huge yields and that kind of thing. That was the debate, and it wasn't any consideration that I came across about microbes and that side of plant feeding and also people feeding, because it's all related as well, as we're finding out now. Soil microbes are pretty much the same as gut microbes in many ways. And therefore, now that that's in the frame being debated in the last 10 years, say, I think organic growing, but also no-dig growing, which is what I've always done actually right from the beginning, it's really strong, the evidence, because you're growing really healthy soil, and that's growing really healthy plants. And health in the broadest sense of the word as a positive thing, not just absence of disease, say, that just in general terms, but also the health of your food in terms of not just the chemical nutrients it might contain, but how they're wrapped into a bigger envelope with all the biological bits that enable your body to process them efficiently and effectively, and for your gut to get hold of those nutrients that you need. You could eat the best food in the world in terms of chemical analysis, but if you haven't got the microbes in your gut to process it effectively, you're probably excreting quite a bit, and not much goodness is available for you. And so that's where I got really excited now with no-dig and nutrition and the whole linkage between food and health of plants, health of soil. It's pretty seamless, actually. It goes together.
That's a really interesting concept, actually, and one that I hadn't really considered. You trial a lot of things, you measure stuff, you're very analytical with your growing, and you have time and again proven that the no-dig technique yields better results, I think, in terms of certainly volume of produce. Have you ever trialled growing with additional fertilisers, chemical-based fertilisers? I know obviously that would not really be a great thing for your soil and your environment, but have you tried it out of interest?
Not in a market garden context, and certainly never at home, because I'm really against that now. I'm sure that they're actually really bad for soil ecology, and there was a report actually from Rothamsted, of all places. I don't know how they came to study it, but about 2 years ago I put a link onto it on my website, where the scientists were looking at how synthetic fertilizers like nitrogen, soluble nitrogen, were harming or reducing the population of beneficial microbes, fungi in the soil. For example, that's coming out now, and it's only because scientists, for some reason, have decided to look at it. I don't know where that came from, even that desire to look at something like that, which would have been a kind of heresy 15 years ago to them. But in my career, I have used synthetic fertilizer a bit when I was farming as opposed to more gardening in France. I had a small farm. And, I was trying a few things. I plowed up some ground. I grew some garlic. I did use fertilizer. I didn't want to, but they were all saying you should do this. And actually, it didn't grow great garlic. It's partly my lack of skill at growing field scale vegetables. But that taught me it wasn't straightforward. I didn't enjoy doing it. And that's really important. As a gardener or farmer, you've got to enjoy and feel good about what you're doing. And that will help it to work really well. On a small scale, I'm doing now gardening, which I feel much more comfortable with. I don't really like sitting on a tractor. You're a long way from what's going on around you. And mostly it's gardening-wise, as opposed to bigger scale farming, you've got your hands in the soil. Because I've seen both sides. I think I'm a bit unusual in that. I grew up in a farming family. My father had 1,000 acres, and, it was quite big machinery and all that kind of thing. And now I'm cropping a third of an acre. Home acres is bigger than that. The actual ground I crop is a third of an acre. It's all handwork. So I've gone from macro to micro and quite a bit in between, and I can really see the differences there. And it is fascinating, actually, but I love what I'm doing now. I feel really comfortable with that, whereas before I sometimes haven't, because I've been trying to do it on too big a scale.
I'm going to assume people know what no dig is, and if they don't, they need to buy the book, and they need to go on your website and buy your other books. So we'll kind of skip over that a little bit, but you do write in your books that we need compost in order to do no dig in some form or another. And I wondered, do you feel that it's essential to create your own within your garden space, or are there other things you can use?
Do you mean for the compost you're going to put on the ground?
Yes, when you're prepping the beds, and I guess going forward as well, there's kind of two slightly different elements there. Would you use your homemade compost for the beds as they got established and maybe accept other types when you're prepping the beds, or would you prefer homemade compost for both eventualities?
I mean, there are so many options. The thing with homemade compost is, for most of us, I think, including me, is can one make enough? Not so much for no dig generally, because ongoing, I reckon I can when I'm using not a huge annual dose, but it's more when making a bed at the beginning. I do feel it's worthwhile to put on extra compost to really up the fertility, the moisture holding capacity, for example, especially anyone on light soil. I really would recommend 6 inches of compost at the beginning. And I would say this is not peculiar to no dig, because there's a misunderstanding, I feel, that you need a lot of compost for no dig. What I'm talking about here is not specifically no dig. I'm talking about growing great vegetables in a small area, because that's the focus of what I'm wanting people to do. You'll find it much more efficient use of your time and resources if you concentrate them on a small area. So sometimes the amounts of compost can seem high, but usually we're talking about a small area. Small area, full-size allotment, for example, is 1/16 of an acre. It's huge. Homemaker's garden, until 18 months ago, before I bought the acre field behind, my cropped area was 1/4 of an acre. That was equivalent to 4 full-size allotments. And from that, we were selling over £20,000 worth of vegetables every year. That's from 4 allotments. And as well as feeding everybody here and feeding people coming on courses, lunches, that kind of thing. So to give you an idea of the high productivity, and that's what's efficient about no dig in terms of the amount of compost you need. It's not that no dig needs loads of compost. It's about concentrating it on often quite a small area to get an incredible output. And where I'm comparing the results from the same amount of compost in 2 beds side by side, where one I dig, one I don't dig, they receive the same amount of compost, but the no dig bed gives 10 to 15% more output. So it's very efficient. For no dig, you need less compost actually than when you're digging for the equivalent amount of yield. And then you were asking about, using homemade. So basically, at the beginning, to get this extra compost done to make a high fertility bed, if you like, from scratch in year 1, I recommend buying some and maybe putting the homemade on top and you'll get the immediate benefit of all the lovely microbes in there. Because sometimes when you buy compost like green waste compost, for example, as it's called, or municipal stuff made by big compost companies, and they chop it all up, a lot of woody ingredients, and then they turn it frequently, get it really hot, 80 centigrade, kills most of the microbes actually, except thermophilic bacteria, and it ticks their boxes, no pathogens in there. But as a customer, you're getting quite a dead product, and it maybe not ready either, it might be still hot. That's not ideal to use long term, but it can help, especially if you leave it to mature a bit, to use it for the base of a bed, or maybe mushroom compost, anything you can buy. Or, leaf mold, if you've got some of that nearby. Compost is a very broad word. It covers many possibilities. Old wood chip, if you dig to the bottom of an old pile of wood chip, it's almost compost at the bottom there. You can use as well. So I'm hoping that most people can find the possibilities they need to get going like this, and then going forward, you don't need so much, and keep your high-quality compost you make, because it will be high-quality what you make at home. It doesn't have to look perfect. It'll have great microbes, that's part of it, and spread a thin layer on top.
Obviously, you say you sell a lot of your produce, you feed people who then kind of go away from the site. Do you ever get into a deficit because you're taking things out of the soil, and then you obviously are making your compost with what you produce on site, but obviously, I guess you're extracting more than you're putting back in. How does that work?
That's a really interesting question, because I'm selling maybe 3 tons of vegetables a year. I know a lot of that is water, but nonetheless, that's quite a bit of, say, carbon leaving the land. The way I like to put it is that this could work if my customers return their poo. If we're not closing that loop, that's where you need another source of fertility for, say, your market garden or farming. And in a garden where you're just growing food for yourself, I see no reason why anybody shouldn't have a compost loo and put all of its output into their compost heap. There's a book by a guy called, I think it's Jenkins actually, he's American, and it's called Manure, H-U Manure, and that's a very powerful case he makes. I wouldn't do it here though. I have a compost loo, but I put the poo output of the compost loo on rose bushes and fruit trees and that kind of thing, just because I'm selling salads. So I just wouldn't do that here. But anyone could if it's for home use. I see it as no risk whatsoever. It's only beneficial. We put the urine part, which is when people have a pee, it goes into hail straw, and we put that on our compost heaps. And so that stimulates the compost heap, and we get nice compost as one of the ingredients.
Yeah, that's Joseph Jenkins. He's been on the podcast, actually, and that book is just incredible. Really one of them ones that you read and go, oh, my God, we're doing it so wrong, aren't we?
It's a powerful debate to be had here. And I know some people find it strange if they haven't really thought about it, and the thought of putting human manure, say, on your land, where animal manure is just what's different, really. It's either come from us or an animal.
Do you give the beds a year off, for example, as well, in rotation? Or do you just keep them going as well?
I keep my beds in constant production, because what I now reckon, I didn't used to get this because it wasn't much discussed. When I was starting out, the debate was framed as, the classic statement I would hear these professors saying when they gave a lecture was, the soil is like a bank balance, nutrients in, nutrients out. And they would just look at it in those chemical terms. And if you didn't put much in, well, you wouldn't get much out. But now we're coming to see that the soil is a living process. And if you can keep that process really active, you can keep cropping. And that leads on to, it's better actually to keep beds full of plants, at least, and plant roots, because that's feeding life into the soil and feeding the soil life, because roots are exudating, excreting carbon that is coming from photosynthesis. So that's why it's beneficial to have something growing all through the season, at least not necessarily in winter. I don't think it's so important then. But say in our climate between March and early November. And therefore, I don't ever give my beds a year off, or even a month off if I can help it. Sometimes there is. But I keep cropping all through the year with vegetables. I'm not worrying about a 4-year rotation. I'm just sometimes doing the same thing after the same thing. It depends what happens to go where, really. And that's working really well.
In your new book, they say don't be too slavish about crop rotation. Can no dig help you avoid plant pests and diseases? And if it does, how does that work?
I think that's true. The evidence of what I'm seeing from doing, I've got one trial where I'm growing potatoes in the same soil year after year after year. And this year was the 8th consecutive year of planting potatoes in April there and harvesting them in July. This is second earliest. And then I plant leeks after that. So in every year I'm doing potatoes, leeks, and so on. And the harvest of potatoes this year was the best ever. Start in the 8th year. I think no dig is helping. Having said that, with potatoes, there's a bit of soil disturbance, but the way it happens with potatoes and no dig is so interesting because you can see how the plants are rooting into the soil below. But the tubers, the potatoes themselves, can't get down very deep because it's not loose enough for them. So I pile up a bit of extra compost on top and pull the compost from around to hill them up, if you like, ridge them up. I do get a few more green ones than I should do, really. I probably ought to use a bit more compost, but I don't want to overdo it because I'm trying to keep it in line with everything we do in the rest of the garden. And then we transplant leeks on the very same day we harvest potatoes, often in July. That's the beauty of second earlies. You don't have to wait too long to harvest them. Charlotte, Nicola, Wilger, Estima, all of those varieties can then go in a paper sack in my lean-to next to the house, and they store even until the following spring. So you've got long-term food there from that harvest in July. Meanwhile, you're growing another vegetable, so with the leeks are growing that. Currently, 8th year in a row of leeks, following the 8th year in a row of potatoes, and I've not so far noticed any diminution of health, quality, or output.
I found with our no-dig beds where we put potatoes in, because we're on quite a heavy soil, everybody said, oh, plant your potatoes in the heavy soil and they'll just kind of prep it for future crops because they'll break up the soil. But they didn't. They did stay in the kind of layer of compost, and they did similar to what yours did. And they're so easy to get out. You don't need to dig them. You can just practically kind of reach in and just grab them out.
Because they're near the surface, it's more likely you're going to get them all out. You can get some potatoes deeper down, particularly if you've dug, you've loosened your soil, you get some potatoes going deeper, potatoes themselves. But with no dig, the harvest is near the surface, but the roots are going down into the soil below. We're getting fantastic yields. We got from 1.2 metre bed, 4 foot wide, 6.5 metre, around 20 feet long. This year we got 58 kilos of Charlotte potatoes. And now we've got the leeks growing in glorious health as well. Really encouraging, actually.
Obviously, talking about soil, can you use no-dig techniques on all types of soil?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I get interesting feedback. Well, I've done it 4 different market gardens, and the first one was on stony Cotswold brash, like really stony, small stones, quite high pH. And the second one was on horrible white clay in France. Third one was on kind of more normal yellow clay up the road here, and this one is on silt, which is over clay. So I've done more on heavy than light. They've all worked in a nutshell, and from the feedback I get, the feedback is more like if you're on light soil, chalky, sandy, you need more compost, I'm afraid. Especially for vegetables, you need a good supply of both nutrition and moisture. And both the light soils tend not to have so much of that. So that would be my one variation. But heavy soil, fantastic. If you've got clay and you know that you're just holding moisture, it holds nutrients, your plants can still wheeze into the clay, and you're planting working, if you like, the surface, which is more compost-light and soft and easy.
I was just thinking back to what you were saying about us getting food that might be chemically on the surface nutritionally very good for us, but lacking that kind of, as you said, I think the parcel of the other biology that goes with it to make it absorbable by our guts or any other kind of, I suppose, different things that might be at play there. But obviously that's not been studied in any great detail, and there is a little bit of a leap of faith there. I think maybe sometimes there is that almost instinctive knowledge that we have to go with, literally trusting our guts and bridging the gaps between what we can actually prove with science and what we suspect to be true on a level that maybe we don't even understand. Do you think there is a place for that in gardening and growing food and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It almost made me laugh, actually, when you said that, trust our gut, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. And the gut is part of the brain, so your gut feelings, that's your brain thinking. And so absolutely right to follow those feelings. They are kind of thoughts, you call it what you like, really. But I had a fascinating discussion with a book editor about this, and it was about someone who's writing a book on nutrition that's come out very recently. And I said to him, wow, this is amazing. So presumably in this latest book on nutrition, they'll be touching on these subjects and mentioning how food from soil that's really full of microbes is probably going to be more nutritious because you can digest it more easily. And he said, well, the author had said to him, it's not possible to put that in because there are no peer-reviewed studies. And that, for me, is the issue with a lot of the scientific process that we seem to have at the moment. Because if you're waiting for a peer-reviewed study, you're waiting a long time, often. But more, it's about that closed loop. Peer review, I might be being a bit controversial here, but this is how I see it. Peer reviewing is mostly done by other scientists. So chances are that you're going around in a loop. And how do you break out of that with new knowledge that is going to have a favourable peer review? And that's why I couldn't agree more that we need to follow our gut instinct, I think, many times. And, I did that with no dig. Because when I started out, I was reading peer-reviewed studies, scientific work, where people were saying that vegetables did not use the mycorrhizal network of mycelia to grow. It does not benefit them to have beneficial fungi in the soil, that they were only used for trees and bushes. This was in the 1980s. That was the consensus in the scientific world that I was picking up anyway. It turns out, no, it's not like that. And that's my issue with science. It's only ever a snapshot of what scientists know at that time. It doesn't make it right what a scientist says or peer reviews. So, yeah, gut feeling is really important.
Definitely. My final question is, why do you think that every last gardener, in the UK at least, has not adopted no dig? I can't understand it. Why are we not all doing it?
Well, that's a fascinating question. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Why? Why? Here you have a method that is beneficial in probably every aspect. It conserves moisture. That's really relevant this year. A lot of people are saying that. No-dig gardeners, watering much less than their neighbours on the allotment say. But then in wet weather, you get better drainage. You get fewer weeds. It's more carbon efficient. So you're keeping carbon in the soil because you're not losing carbon to oxidation into CO2 through cultivation. You get a more beneficial ecology in the soil. Like, for example, you're not disturbing the beetles and toads that would eat your slug eggs. So you get less pest damage. The list goes on. And so, yeah, why? It's easier. What's the problem? Trying to answer, I think it's fascinating because it takes you down into different roads, really. The whole psychology of how the human mind works. And I think group thinking, there are not many people who like to stand out as a bit different. And we haven't quite got to the point where I feel that no-dig is the critical mass or whatever the stage it needs to be, that enough people are doing it that it kind of becomes acceptable in a general sense. I think we're very close to that. Might have actually got there very recently. But until now, that hasn't been the case, and I think that's put people off. They don't like to do something different. And I hear quite a few allotment holders saying, they get quite a bit of stick from the old guys coming up and say, oh, you should dig that in. And they'll tell them in quite an authoritative way. So, we know, we've been doing it for 40 years, whatever. But they haven't seen this other method that turns out actually works a lot better than what they've been doing. I would say, personally, I found the information difficult to get out there until recently because there has been a resistance, even in the gardening media. It's a bit the same story. They don't like to rock the boat too much and maybe alienates many of their readers who think this is ridiculous not to do proper digging or whatever it might be. That is changing now, but what I found has really helped me has been social media, because I don't need permission from anybody, like an editor or someone, to write an article. I can just publish what is happening, say, in my garden, give the evidence of what I'm doing, and people can see the results. And that has been very persuasive, and so I'm very grateful to that. I've had that possibility, and I think that's really helped get it out there, actually. Just going underneath the sort of the mainstream a bit and just reaching out to people, individuals all over the world. It's been really, really fun.
Thank you very much to Charles, and thank you to you for listening. The Human Manure Handbook, which Charles mentioned, is by Joseph Jenkins, who appeared on the podcast speaking about it in episode 149, and I've put a link to it in the show notes, and also to the Stephanie Hafferty episode. Stephanie used to work with Charles and is another fantastic grower, cook and author. Also, thank you very much to those of you who responded to my shout out asking for feedback on the podcast. I'm not going to change it or stop doing it, so apologies if you got that impression. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm giving you what you want, and if there are ways I can improve the offering, so I appreciate all your feedback. I'll leave you now with Dr. Ian Bedford, speaking about something that's amazing and awe-inspiring, but that you definitely don't want a face full of.
In habitats throughout the world, a remarkable 45,000 different species of spider have so far been discovered, and 650 of these reside in Britain. Besides their key features of having 8 legs and a venomous bite, all spiders produce silk, and they use their silk for different purposes, such as creating egg sacs, traversing surfaces, and for wrapping up and storing their food. But probably the most well-known use of their silk is to create webs that are usually suspended between structures for catching their prey. However, not all spiders use webs for this purpose, since some make them into protective canopies for their young, whilst others lay them on the ground, where they work like tripwires to alert the spiders to danger or prey. And there's even spiders that don't make any webs, but just rely on their stealth and camouflage for ambushing their victims. But for those that do make webs, they'll follow a distinct format, ranging from orbs and sheets to lace and funnel shapes. And the web's architecture will often be so unique that it'll reveal the family or even the species of spider that created it. How these spiders instinctively build their webs, though, remains one of the fascinating enigmas of the natural world. But this innate behavioural trait has clearly become hardwired into their DNA over the 100 million years that we know from specimens within ancient amber they've been using silk to trap their prey. Spiders produce their silk from a gland inside their body, and it's stored as a liquid inside their abdomen. Then, when required, the spider uses its rear legs to push the liquid out through tiny pores called spinnerets, where, as it emerges, it rapidly dries into a little silk thread. A thread that research discovered is amongst the strongest and most resilient natural fibre that's ever been found, which unbelievably is 5 times stronger than steel. And when it's made into a mesh, it's tough enough to stop a small bullet. It's also very elastic and incredibly lightweight. So if ways are found to mass-produce spider silk cost-effectively in the future, then our 8-legged acquaintances from the natural world may well have given us all the potential to protect our bodies with clothing that previously might only have been seen in a comic book.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.